It was the kind of morning where everything felt ordinary sunlight filtering in through tall classroom windows. The drone of cicadas outside, the scrape of chairs as students took their places. Miss Emery, the fifth-grade teacher at Brookfield Elementary, clapped her hands sharply, calling the class to order. "Everyone rise for the Pledge of Allegiance," she announced, her voice as crisp as the blue cotton dress she wore. 31 students stood, pushing back chairs with clumsy thuds, hands rising in unison to cover hearts. They faced the faded American flag, pinned above the chalkboard, its threads frayed with time, but still fluttering slightly from the open windows. But one girl didn't move. Lillian Green, seated in the second row beside the bookshelf, stayed perfectly still, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Her large brown eyes stared forward, not defiantly, but with quiet resolve. She looked small in her desk, a slim 12-year-old in a hand-me-down dress. Her black hair pulled into a tight braid knot. At first, no one noticed. But as the class recited the opening words, "I pledge allegiance to the flag," a boy next to her nudged her elbow. Lillian didn't flinch. He whispered sharply, "You forgot to stand." She didn't respond. By the time the class reached double quotes ... and to the republic for which it stands, a wave of confusion swept the room. Miss Emery stopped speaking mid-phrase, her eyes locking on Lillian. The rest of the class turned, silence crashing over them like a thunderclap. "Lillian?" the teacher said, gently but with rising concern. "Why aren't you standing?" Lillian looked up at her calmly. "I don't do the pledge," she said. The room inhaled as one. Whispers shot through the rows. 2 girls exchanged stunned glances. A boy near the back muttered something about un-American. Even the flag seemed to still, as if offended by the words. Miss Emery's smile faded. Her posture stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" Lillian cleared her throat. Her voice was steady, soft, but unshakable. "I'm a Jehovah's Witness. My faith doesn't allow us to salute flags or say pledges. We only worship God." The room exploded in sound. Chairs scraped, murmurs surged, and a boy in the front row let out an exaggerated gasp. Miss Emery raised a hand. "Class quiet? Everyone quiet now." She walked slowly toward Lillian's desk. Her heels clicked like drumbeats on the hardwood floor. "You mean to say," she said carefully, "that you're refusing to participate in the pledge because of your religion?" Lillian nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The teacher stared at her, lips tight. She had taught here for 18 years. This had never happened, not during war, not during peace. The school was patriotic. Brookfield was patriotic. America was at war. Boys from their own town had gone off to fight. Some had already died in Europe or the Pacific. "You do understand what this flag represents?" Miss Emery asked. "Our country, our freedom, our soldiers." "Yes," Lillian said softly. "That's why we shouldn't be forced to worship it." The words stunned the room again, this time deeper. Even Miss Emery seemed to lose her footing for a moment. She looked around. The other students now watched like an audience at a theater, wide-eyed, tense. The stillness was eerie. The war had reached them in other ways. Ration books, telegrams, gold stars in windows, but never like this. "All right," Miss Emery said, finally finding her voice. "You'll come with me to the principal's office. We'll discuss this further." Lillian stood then, but not in defiance. She picked up her books and walked toward the door, head held high. A few classmates leaned away as she passed, like she carried something dangerous. Others stared with uneasy admiration. The hallway was silent, echoing their footsteps as they walked. Miss Emery didn't speak. Neither did Lillian. But the silence was alive with 1,000 questions. When they reached the principal's door, Miss Emery hesitated before knocking. Then quietly, she muttered something that surprised even herself. "I hope you know what you're doing." Lillian glanced at her. I do. And she meant it. Asterisk Principal Harold. Hart was a tall man with a temper carefully tucked behind his pressed suit and slicked back hair. When Miss Emery knocked and entered with Lillian Green by her side, he was mid-sip of his coffee. He set it down without a word. She refused to stand for the pledge, Miss Emery said without preamble. Hart blinked. She what? She stayed seated. Said it's against her religion. Hart leaned back slowly in his chair, his fingers steepled. He looked at the girl standing beside his desk. Small, calm, unapologetic. Something about that made him uneasy. Children usually cried when sent to his office. This one looked like she'd expected it. Well, Miss Green, he said, care to explain yourself? Lillian nodded. We don't worship flags. Or any symbols, only God. You think the pledge is worship? It's a pledge of allegiance. That's a promise. And the Bible says we can't serve two masters. Hart's mouth twitched, a reaction he quickly buried beneath a bureaucratic tone. That may be, but this is a school, not a church. Here we teach respect for the flag and the nation it represents. Lillian said nothing. The silence unsettled him more than any argument might have. I see, Hart muttered. He stood and walked to the window, hands behind his back. Outside, students played kickball. A teacher blew a whistle. Life was continuing out there, but something inside the school had shifted, and he could feel it. He turned back. You're suspended for the day. Tomorrow, if you still refuse, we'll take further action. Dismissed. Miss Emery flinched slightly, but said nothing. Lillian nodded. Yes, sir. She turned and left quietly. By the time she stepped out of the front office, the storm had already begun. The whispers moved faster than sound. She passed a group of 8th grade boys who had clearly heard. One of them saluted mockingly. Another muttered, "Come, lover." A girl near the lockers gasped and said, "That's her." A younger student ran off, presumably to tell more. Felt their eyes on her. Curious, angry, afraid. She kept walking. Word didn't just stay in the school. By dinner time, the phone at the greenhouse rang off the hook. Her teacher had called earlier with a disciplinary report. Then came the neighbors, asking, "Is it true what Lillian did?" Some were concerned. Others were furious. In small towns like Brookfield, news didn't spread. It detonated. By the next morning, the local paper had caught wind of the incident. The front page of the Brookfield Herald read, 12-year-old refuses flag salute. Cites religion over patriotism. Subheadlines included phrases like war effort undermined and parents silent on child's rebellion. At school, things had shifted overnight. Some teachers stopped making eye contact with her. Others watched her closely, as if waiting for her to explode. During recess, no one spoke to her. A few children pointed from a distance. The word traitor was scribbled on her locker in pencil. Yet Lillian showed up, books in hand, and once again did not stand. Principal Hart pulled her from class before the pledge even began. He met her with clenched teeth. "You're forcing my hand," he said. She nodded. "Do what you think is right." That phrase, "what you think is right," haunted him all day. Calls came in from the school board. One number was furious. "She's creating a bad example," he barked. "This isn't the time for rebellion. We're at war." Another offered caution. "Do we really want to punish a child for her faith? This could turn into a legal issue." By the time school let out, the question wasn't just about discipline, it was about the Constitution. That night, her family sat at the dinner table in tense silence. Her father, James Green, finally spoke. "We didn't raise you to follow." The crowd. Her mother reached over and touched Lillian's hand. "But this will come at a cost, sweetheart." Lillian looked at them, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let it cost something." Outside, the American flag on. Their porch rustled gently in the summer breeze, unaware it had become the center of a battle far larger than itself. By Thursday, Brookfield wasn't just talking about Lillian Green. They were dividing over her dot at Martin's grocery. Two women argued in the checkout line. One waved a copy of the Brookfield Herald, the bold headline visible beneath her arm. "Child refuses salute again. Discipline pending." "She's just a kid," said one woman. 12 years old. "Can't we show a little understanding?" "Understanding?" the other snapped. "My nephew just shipped out to the Pacific. She can't stand for the flag he's fighting under?" Even the town barber, Mr. Denby, weighed in, telling every customer, "Back in my day, if you didn't salute, they'd have you scrubbing latrines." Soon, talk moved to action. Parents filled the next school board meeting, crowding into the tiny auditorium with patriotic pins on their coats and righteous anger in their voices. Woman named Mrs. Radley stood up first. Her son, Michael, sat next to Lillian in class. "She's influencing the others," she said. "Yesterday, Michael came home and asked why we say the pledge. He questioned it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Another man-retired Army rose. With his cane and fury, "I lost a son in Italy," he said, voice cracking. "We gave blood for that flag. If she won't respect it, she shouldn't be in our schools." Applause broke out, mixed with murmurs of agreement. Only one man stood in silence, Pastor Keller, who eyed the crowd thoughtfully, but said nothing. Back at the greenhouse, the atmosphere had changed. Their mailbox overflowed with letters, some anonymous, many venomous. "Leave town. America doesn't need your kind. You'll burn in hell." One envelope contained a drawing, a stick figure kneeling in flames with LG. Written above it, "James Green burned that one in the fireplace without showing." Lillian, the hardware store, refused to serve her mother. At church, the family was asked not to return quietly, firmly, with eyes downcast. Too much tension. The elder said, "We have to keep peace." Even Lillian's best friend, Nora, stopped walking home with her. One afternoon, Lillian waited by the gate. Nora walked by without a word. It hurt, but Lillian didn't flinch. That night, as rain tapped the roof, James paced the living room. "This isn't going away," he muttered. "They're pushing for expulsion." His wife placed a hand on his shoulder. "She hasn't done anything wrong," he nodded. "But right or wrong doesn't seem to matter." Lillian listened from the staircase, fingers gripping the railing. Her family was paying the price too. She felt it deeply, but something deeper rooted her to her decision. It wasn't rebellion. It was obedience. To God, not man. The following week, a journalist from the Charleston Gazette called. He'd heard about Lillian through a colleague. "I'd like to speak to the girl," he told Mr. Green. They agreed to meet on Saturday. Lillian wore her Sunday dress. She answered questions clearly, never raising her voice, never shrinking from the man's gaze. "Why not just stand, even if you don't mean it?" he asked. "Because it's still a lie," she replied. The article published 2 days later. The headline read, "Faith Over Flag, a Child's Quiet Protest in Brookfield." This time, not all the letters were hateful. One came from Chicago, from a man who wrote, "I served in the Navy, so kids like yours wouldn't have to lie about their beliefs." Another from New York, "Tell your daughter her courage gives me hope for this country." And one, unsigned, "The girl is right. I just never had the guts to say it." The tide was turning slowly, but in Brookfield, the anger still boiled. Protesters had begun gathering outside the school each morning. One carried a sign, "God or country, pick one." And Lillian? She kept picking the same one. Every morning, she sat quietly as the flag rose and the room stood. And though her voice made no sound, her silence kept getting louder. The turning point came when a man in a gray suit knocked on the Green family's door. He wasn't a journalist. He introduced himself as Elliot Berman, an attorney from the American Civil Liberties Union, a group that had quietly followed Lillian's story since the first article ran. "I believe your daughter's rights are being violated," he said. James Green studied the man. The Aklu? The name alone would ruffle feathers in town. But after weeks of harassment, fear, and silence, Lillian finally had someone willing to speak out loudly, publicly, and with legal teeth. Berman laid out the plan. What's happening here violates the First Amendment. Freedom of religion. Freedom of conscience. It's all protected under the Constitution. We've defended cases like this before. If the school expels her, we'll take it to court. Court. The word sent a chill through the room. We're not looking to make a scene, James said cautiously. Berman gave a thin smile. You already have one. By the following week, the local school board held a closed-door session and confirmed what most expected. They were proceeding with Lillian's permanent expulsion. The crowd outside cheered when the news broke. The headline the next day declared, "Flag Defier removed from Brookfield classroom." But they hadn't counted on what happened next. Within days, Berman filed suit in federal district court, claiming unlawful expulsion and violation of constitutional rights. Suddenly, this wasn't just a town scandal. It was a national legal matter. Reporters flooded Brookfield. NBC sent a camera crew. Time magazine ran a feature, "The Girl Who Sat Still." Politicians chimed in. One congressman praised her courage. Another called her a disgrace. A heated debate emerged on radio shows and in editorial columns across the country. In classrooms nationwide, children began asking questions. Why do we say the pledge? Can you be American and not stand? What if we believe something different? In New Jersey, 3 students refused to recite the pledge and cited Lillian. In California, a teacher was suspended for refusing to enforce it. The wave had started, and Lillian was its quiet center. Back in Brookfield, she no longer walked the streets without a shadow. Her family received police escorts after a brick was thrown through their window. One afternoon, someone spray-painted Trader House on their garage. James Green sat at the kitchen table one night and said, "Maybe we should leave. Move north. Start over." But Lillian shook her head. "If we run, it's like saying we were wrong." Her words carried a gravity that stunned even her parents. She wasn't angry. She was rooted deep and still like an oak in a storm. Meanwhile, Berman worked tirelessly. His argument was clear. No child should be forced to violate their faith to access education. He pointed to West Virginia State Board of Education, v. Barnett, a pending Supreme Court case involving Jehovah's Witnesses and forced flag salutes. Your daughter's case may help shape the outcome, Berman said. If the Supreme Court sides with Barnett, Lillian could change history. In school board meetings, resistance dug in deeper. This is about loyalty, one member shouted. We're at war. Dissent is dangerous. But others began to waver. Quiet. Voices rose among the townspeople. A war widow who said her husband fought for freedom, not just flags. A teacher who remembered being told, once, not to ask questions and regretted staying silent. And then came the moment that shook everything. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Barnett. In a landmark 6-3 decision, the justices declared that no government entity could force students to salute the flag or recite the pledge. Justice Robert Jackson wrote in his majority opinion, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, or religion. That night, Berman called the Greens. You won, he said simply. Lillian didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just whispered, good. And as the sun set over Brookfield, A town once burning with fury now stood at a crossroads, with one girl's quiet stand echoing all the way from a classroom to the highest court in the land. The morning after the Supreme Court ruling, the flag at Brookfield Elementary rose again. This time, for the first time in nearly 2 months, Lillian Green stood beside her classmates. She still didn't recite the pledge. She still didn't place her hand over her heart. She still didn't look at the flag, but she stood, just stood out of respect for the ruling and for the space it now gave her. And no one stopped her. Inside the school, a strained silence hung in the halls. Students whispered less, but they still stared. Some watched her as if waiting for another explosion, another scandal. Others just looked confused. A few even curious. Teachers were split. Miss Emery, original homeroom teacher, avoided her gaze entirely, rarely called on her, and left red ink on papers with unusual ferocity. But Mr. Garnell, the history teacher, nodded to her the next day and said gently, "Welcome back, Miss Green. It's good to see you here." The classroom felt different now. He spoke openly about the case, even used it in discussion. "This," he told the class, holding up a newspaper with her photo on the front page, "is how history happens. Sometimes one person stands up or sits down, and the country takes notice." Lillian didn't smile, but she listened. At home, things began to settle, but not entirely. The mailbox still brought letters. Some were now kind. Others were bitter, accusing the family of bringing disgrace or using religion as an excuse. The hardware store still refused them. Some neighbors waved. Others crossed the street. The town was divided, not healed, and while she was allowed to return to school, her parents were warned, gently but firmly, that it might be better if she didn't stay. "There's still tension," the superintendent had said. "We're not questioning your right. We're questioning the atmosphere." That Friday, Lillian opened her locker and found a note folded carefully into her math book. It read, "I wish I was brave like you." No name, no handwriting she recognized. But it sat like a small beam of light inside her chest for the rest of the day. Outside of Brookfield, however, the story had taken on a life of its own. News stations in New York and Chicago ran specials about the girl who sparked a conversation across the country. One magazine named her Young American of the Year. A university professor wrote her a letter calling her a living example of moral resistance. But Lillian didn't feel famous. She felt tired. One evening, her mother found her staring out her bedroom window as dusk fell. "Do you regret it?" Her mother asked softly. Lillian thought for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not what I did, but how much it cost." Her mother knelt beside her. Courage always costs something. That Sunday, Pastor Keller, the man who had once remained silent at the school board meeting, invited the Green family back to church. "No more turning you away," he said. "We failed you once. We won't again." They went, quietly, sat in the back row. The sermon was simple and calm, and though no one clapped, more than one head turned as they walked in and stayed turned. When they walked out, the world hadn't changed overnight, but something had cracked, opened, shifted. A week later, Nora walked home with her again. "I told my mom I missed you," she said. She didn't like it, but she didn't stop. Lillian looked at her. "That's something." "Yeah," Nora said. "It's something." That night, Lillian took out a small notebook and wrote a sentence on the inside cover. "I didn't do it to be different. I did it because I couldn't be the same." She closed the notebook, placed it beside her bed, and lay down. The town hadn't forgiven her, but the country had hurt her, and somehow that was enough to keep going. Months passed. Summer bloomed in Brookfield, but the weight of what had happened didn't melt with the snow. Lillian Green's name had become more than a headline. It had become a symbol. And like most symbols, people shaped her meaning to fit their own beliefs. Some praised her, some condemned her. A few still didn't know what to make of her, but something undeniable was happening. Across the country, students in other states began following her lead. In Kansas, a 7th grader declined to say the pledge during a Veterans Day ceremony. In Oregon, a small group of children cited religious reasons for sitting quietly during flag salutes. Each time, local papers made note of the Brookfield precedent. And each time, Lillian's name surfaced again. The ACLU called James Green in early August. Requests are pouring in, Berman said. Would Lillian be willing to speak at a student rights summit in Philadelphia? James asked Lillian privately. She paused, then asked a question of her own. Will it help other kids not feel alone? James smiled. Yes, it will. She agreed on one condition: no stage, no lights. I don't want to be the center of anything. I just want to talk. So in mid-September, they boarded a train east. It was the first time Lillian had left West Virginia. She watched trees blur past the windows, wondering if every other town felt the same fear of difference, the same pride and silence. Philadelphia overwhelmed her. So much noise, so many buildings, so many people who didn't know her face and didn't whisper as she passed Dot at the summit. She sat on a modest panel with 4 other students who had faced backlash for expressing their belief. One had refused to pray in school. Another had worn a headscarf against dress code rules. It was her turn to speak. The room quieted. She was the youngest by far. She didn't read from notes. She didn't raise her voice. I didn't sit out the pledge because I hate the flag, she began. I sat because I was told to stand for something I didn't believe. I thought we were allowed to believe differently. No applause followed, only silence. But it wasn't judgment. It was respect. Later, a girl from North Carolina approached her in the hallway. My school won't let me read from my Bible during free time. She said, your story helped my mom fight back. Lillian blinked. Did it work? The girl nodded. We won. Back home, Brookfield remained cautious. Some wounds still lingered. There were still store clerks who refused to serve her family. Still glances of disapproval in church. Still tension during town meetings when the Greens walked in. But the outrage had softened into something else: curiosity. Even quiet admiration that Mr. Darnell asked Lillian to help organize a Constitution Day event. He let her read a short passage from the Bill of Rights in front of the class. When she finished, a boy in the front row muttered, Guess she actually knows what it says. He meant it as a joke, but even jokes held truth. Later that week, Lillian was called into the principal's office. Mr. Palmer stood behind his desk, not angry this time, but composed. We've been contacted by a publishing company, he said. They're assembling a collection of essays by students who've made a difference. They want to include yours, what you said in Philadelphia. Lillian hesitated. Only if it's okay with you, he added. She nodded. Okay. That evening, she wrote the essay by hand. She ended it with a single line. I never meant to start anything. But if what I did helped someone else find their voice, I'm glad I spoke with silence. The next morning she placed the envelope on the outgoing mail pile. It was addressed to New York City. The girl who had once been shouted out of her classroom was now being read in classrooms across the nation. And the silence that started, it all was growing louder still. By the time Lillian turned 15, the story of the girl who refused to salute had been told and retold so many times. Even she barely recognized it anymore. Her name appeared in textbooks now. Not full chapters, just a mention under a sidebar titled Student Rights in the 20th Century. Her photo from the Philadelphia summit, hair tied back, eyes focused but tired, became an unofficial symbol of youthful dissent. Sometimes she'd be walking to class When someone she didn't know would say, "Hey, you're that girl, right?" she'd nod, offer a polite smile. But inside, a question always stirred. Was that all I was now? That girl? Lillian wanted to be more. She wanted to be Lillian, who loved drawing birds in the margins of her notebooks. Lillian, who played piano softly when no one was listening. Lillian, who dreamed of being a writer, maybe even a teacher, not just a historical footnote. But reclaiming her ordinary life proved harder than expected. Some people still held grudges. Miss Emery never warmed up to her and once told the class. Some students believe they're bigger than the lesson. Everyone knew who she meant. Others saw her as a role model, but one they didn't really understand. When a freshman tried to start a free speech club and asked Lillian to join, she politely declined. "I'm not trying to start something," she said. "I'm just trying to finish growing up." Yet the past kept finding her. One morning, she was called to the front office. A package had arrived, no return address. Inside was a leather-bound notebook and a single sentence on the first page. "Your silence gave me a voice. Thank you." There was no signature, just a faint drawing of a dove in the corner, simple, elegant, familiar. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers brushing the paper. It was the same dove she used to sketch during sermons when she was little. Someone had remembered. She brought the notebook home and began writing in it, not speeches or statements, but thoughts, fragments of poems, descriptions of the sky, letters she'd never send. In those pages, she slowly found the girl behind the symbol. Meanwhile, her family started to breathe again. James reopened his mechanic shop, with help from friends who had once stayed silent. Her mother joined the town council's education committee, determined to be a voice where once she felt voiceless, and Nora became a constant presence again. The friendship had returned, not the same, but stronger, wiser, forged by fire and distance. "You know," Nora said one afternoon as they walked past the old playground, "I used to think brave people looked different." "Different how?" Lillian asked. "Louder, flashier, like superheroes." Lillian smiled. "Me, too. But maybe real brave just means not changing your answer, even when everyone wants you to." Lillian didn't say anything, but she held that sentence like a stone in her pocket, carrying it long after. That fall, something unexpected happened. A teacher from another district, Mr. Douglas, from Charleston, asked if Lillian would visit his class to talk about the case. Just a short visit, informal. "They've been reading about you," he explained. "I think it would mean something if they could ask questions." Lillian hesitated. She didn't want to be a speaker, but maybe she could be a presence. Just a person. Not a symbol. So she said yes. In the classroom, surrounded by curious eighth graders, someone asked, "Were you scared?" She answered honestly, "Yes." Another asked, "Would you do it again?" She paused. "Yes," she said, "but not because I liked what happened. I'd do it again because I believe you shouldn't have to stop being yourself just to fit in." The room was silent, thoughtful. On the drive home, her mother glanced at her. "You okay?" Lillian nodded. "I think I'm getting there." The world had once told her who she was. Now, finally, she was telling it back. Years passed, and the name Lillian Green slowly faded from headlines. Brookfield grew, changed. New houses were built. Old teachers retired. People moved on except for a few who quietly remembered. And Lillian? She never left West Virginia. Not really. She attended a small liberal arts college upstate and majored in education. She wanted to teach not history, oddly enough, but literature. Books, she told a friend once, let you feel what someone else felt. That's the only way we ever really understand each other. By 30, she was teaching English at a public high school just outside Charleston. Her students loved her. Not because she was the girl who refused to salute. Most of them had no idea. They loved her because she asked real questions and waited for real answers. Because she listened. Because she let quiet kids stay quiet. And taught them how powerful that quiet could be. She married at 32, a quiet wedding on a hillside. Just family and wildflowers. Her husband, Daniel, was a carpenter who never once asked her about the Supreme Court. If you want to talk about it, you will, he'd said. She didn't. Not much. They had one daughter, June, named after Lillian's mother. And though Lillian raised her to stand tall, speak clearly, and think for herself, she never once told her what had happened when she was 12. Not because she was ashamed of that, but because she didn't want her daughter to carry her story. She wanted her to make her own. And for years she did, until one autumn afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young teacher from another school emailed her out of the blue. He was building a lesson on student rights and civic courage, and had come across her story in an old textbook. He was stunned to learn she lived nearby. "I teach 8th grade civics," he wrote. "Would you ever consider speaking to my class?" Lillian stared at the message for a long time. Then she turned to June, now 17, sitting at the kitchen table. "Have I ever told you about what happened when I was your age?" she asked. June shook her head. "No. Should you?" Lillian smiled. "Maybe. It's time." That Friday, she stood in front of 26 8th graders in a modest classroom, her hands loosely clasped. She didn't bring a script. She didn't wear anything fancy. She simply spoke. "I didn't refuse to salute the flag because I hated my country," she began. "I did it because I believed my country should make room for people like me. People who think differently, who worship differently, who speak quietly instead of shouting." One student raised a hand. "Were you scared of getting punished?" She nodded, terrified. "But fear doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means what you're doing matters." Another asked, "Did anyone stand with you?" Lillian smiled gently. "Not at first. But over time, yes, more than I ever expected." When the bell rang, one student hung back and handed her a folded note. She opened it in the car. "Sometimes I feel like I have to pretend to be someone I'm not. You made me feel less alone." The handwriting was familiar, tight, uncertain, like her own once was. That night, Lillian sat on the porch with Daniel and watched the stars come out. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. She thought for a while. "No," she said, "because it's still with me. I just learned how to share it." That winter, the Smithsonian requested one of her original essays for an exhibit on youth and protest in American history. She mailed them a copy, but kept the original. She placed it in a drawer, beside the leather notebook, the old photo from Philadelphia, and the small sketch of the dove. Lillian Green never became a politician. She never wrote a book, but she raised a daughter who knew how to listen and taught hundreds of students how to think. And in a small town where once she was called un-American, her name now appeared on a plaque outside the local library, in honor of Lillian Green, who taught youth that freedom sometimes speaks in silence. And that was more than enough.